Welcome to another episode of Dialogues. I'm really excited for you to hear today's conversation. I was excited to have it with the philosopher Jennifer Morton. I've followed her work for a while. We actually work in a similar space around intergenerational mobility. And she wrote a very interesting book in 2019 called Moving Up Without Losing Your Way, The Ethical Costs of Upward Mobility. And she's one of the few philosophers I think that takes seriously with the costs of upward mobility as well as the benefits. She's associate professor currently at UNC Chapel Hill, but moving to Penn in the fall. I discovered that during our conversation. And we go through what are the costs of upward mobility in terms of friendships, community, and so on, both to the individual and arguably to the community that we leave behind. We talk about the role of luck in our lives. In her case, a family member falling in love with the right person at the right time, setting her on a different trajectory. I worry quite a bit about how far we should just leave these choices to the individual, but we do agree that it would be good to make some of the trade-offs people have to make less sharp and reduce the inequalities in those trade-offs and reduce the number of zero-sum games in our society. We talk about her own fears as a Latina immigrant who's a first-generation college student of ticking diversity boxes without necessarily changing institutions. And actually spent a lot of time on the narrowness of the institutions from which we draw our elite, and her most recent article, The Miseducation of Our Elite, and how affirmative action isn't really helping, in part because the elite can co-opt people and socialize them into elite norms, and in part because we focus on just too narrow a range of institutions, Ivy League colleges and so on, in terms of where we draw our elite from. And so we conclude with some thoughts on how we could essentially make for a better elite. I really, really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you do too. Jennifer Morton, welcome to Dialogues.
Thank you so much for having me, Richard. I'm a fan of yours. I enjoyed Dream Hoarders, and I'm really excited to talk about upward mobility and related topics today.
Well, I'm a fan of yours too. So this is one of the reasons for me to start a podcast, is to force people to talk to me and then record it, and then hope that other people will listen too. I've been following your work with interest, and I'm going to get onto some of the more recent work you've been doing on the miseducation of our elite, which I think is a natural extension of some of the work in your own book. But let's start by situating you, just for those who don't know your story, because it's highly relevant to your work. I mean, one of my views is that all scholarship is autobiographical in one way or another. It's just whether you realize it or not. So tell us a bit about your story, because it's fascinating, your own educational story from Peru and so on, your own identity transformation, if you like.
Yeah, I was born in Lima, Peru in 1979. So I grew up in the 80s in Peru, which was a very difficult time politically, economically. That was during Shining Path. So terrorism was a constant threat. Also hyperinflation, the economic situation was difficult. And my mom was very young when she had me. And at the time, anyone that could in Peru, or a lot of people that could, try to find ways to immigrate to Europe or the United States. And so my mom and her sister, my aunt, left for Europe at some point. So I grew up mostly with my grandmother. But as it happens, I also got to go to one of the most expensive private schools in Lima, the American School of Lima, which really kind of set me up for, being able to be here today. In a way. And so I was the first person in my family to go to college. And, at the time when I came to the United States to go to college at Princeton, that idea of the first generation college student wasn't what it is today. People didn't sort of have that concept. It wasn't an identity on campus. A lot of the research on first generation college student experience hadn't really been done. So when I got to Princeton, I identified myself as an international student, which was a category, right?
Which you were. It's just that
yes,
that's not all you were. Yeah.
Yeah, that was definitely, there was support around that. There was a center. But a lot of the international students at a place like Princeton came from very privileged backgrounds, right? And so by the time I went to college, my family was better off. But, I had grown up with my working class grandmother who hadn't been to college, had just finished high school. And so my kind of background experience was very different from the experience of a lot of the other international students. So I had to really kind of find my way to a group of friends that kind of felt comfortable for me, right, as a kind of first generation college student and also an international student. And at that point, really an immigrant. So I ended up at Princeton, was already somewhat interested in philosophy, got even more hooked into philosophy, ended up going to grad school, and here I am.
Where did you go to grad school? Where did you go?
Stanford.
Okay, so that's what's one of the things that's interesting about your journey, of course, is that from obviously a troubled environment of your childhood, but elite K-12 or secondary education, elite undergraduate, elite postgraduate, and you're now teaching at a very elite institution, although we'll perhaps get back to that in a moment. And so so your own journey is this sort of intention, I think, with some of the work you're doing, and you're very honest about that. You're very reflective about what you can claim in terms of your own experience, and you claim some sense of what it means to be a striver and go to a different country and so on, but you're also aware that you're privileged in many ways by your own academic background. And you just said at the beginning of this, you probably wouldn't be here having this conversation if you hadn't had that break, which was basically the result of a romantic relationship, if I understand correctly. So
my mom married when I was 3, an expat, an American living in Peru, and she was married to him for a few years, and he got me into this school. And after their relationship broke up, my family knew that this was kind of a golden opportunity. So a lot of the investment they made, my aunt and my mom, when they were working abroad, were sending money back, went to pay for this obscenely expensive school. And so I grew up with that sense that that this education was sort of like a lottery ticket, right? And I had to make something of it because it was a very rare gift in a way. And my family was working very hard to make sure that I stayed in that school. And that was definitely part of my experience. And I think, not everybody shares depending on the background that they have. So I went to school with like the children of prime ministers, right? And the children of like mining tycoons and whatnot. And I remember we had this teacher who was Peruvian, and she kept saying, how much the school costs, what this, she would try to remind the class. And I was always very aware of that. But some of my classmates just had they knew it was expensive, but this was what they expected. I mean, they were from very wealthy families, from families that had been wealthy for many generations. And so their sense of their education and what it meant was just different than mine. And that also really shaped my experience.
Yes, it's just perhaps it's not nobody's fault, but you do habituate to your own culture and what you're used to. I mean, I had my journey was somewhat less dramatic, but when I went to Oxford University from my school, which was a very, very ordinary public school. I think I was only the second or third from my school to go to either Oxford or Cambridge, and it was a slightly idiosyncratic decision even to apply, but I went, and it was a similar experience in the sense that because it's channeling this quite small elite, you suddenly realize that person's surname is the same as that conglomerate.
Right, exactly.
and I remember this guy who would get all these Valentine's cards, and I could never work out why he got so many as me. We shared like a mail slot because we had the same surname. It was R. And he had all these, and then I noticed some of his letters had Right Honourable on it as well. And I realized that he was an aristocrat. He was inheriting some period. I knew him really well. He was actually really nice. But again, it's like that's just these moments of realizing that there are different worlds. Well, let's dig in a little bit to some of the costs of these journeys. And the kind of substance of your book and the ethical goods you talk about. Obviously, your book's 2019, I guess, a couple of years ago now. So I'm sort of playing catch up a little bit in terms of you talking about this. But you talk about ethical goods that are not easily replaced. I'm actually quoting from your work here now. You say the weakening or loss of relationships with family and friends and ties to one's community are not easily compensated for by making new relationships or entering new communities. And we should be reflective about what's being valued here. And so just explain a little bit about what you mean by these, why you think they're kind of so important. And I guess more importantly, why they're lost, why they're necessarily lost or typically lost as a result of being what you call a striver, being upwardly mobile.
Good. So the way I think about these ethical goods is in line with a tradition and philosophy of thinking about ethics as what makes for a flourishing life. And I think for most of us, a really important component of a flourishing life are these relationships that we have with family, with friends, with our communities. Our sense of identity is very tied up with these relationships. And what I argue in the book is that there's often tension for strivers. So I call strivers those first generation or low income students that are trying to, move up the socioeconomic ladder through education, that there is often tension between staying connected to family, to community, to one's neighborhood, maybe one's country, and striving for these educational goods, career opportunities that often are happening somewhere else, right? In other communities, in other places, maybe in other countries. And that there's often a tension there. Now, this tension isn't the same for everyone. So, as we talked about earlier, I'm privileged in many respects. And one of the ways in which I was privileged was that my family, my aunt and my mom, by the time I was going to college, were much better off economically. And so, for example, I didn't have the burden of having to work to pay for my family's care, my sister going to school, or, all of the many other things that I've seen my students have to do where they have to support their families financially. I wasn't expected to be, sending money back as soon as I moved to the United States, which was true of my mom and my aunt. As soon as they left, they were expected to be sending money back to support me and my grandmother. So I had that privilege, but other students don't, and they're expected, and not just expected, they want to support their families, right? They want to be there and help when their family is suffering financially, or maybe they don't have childcare, or they don't have elder care, and they want to be there for their families. But that takes time and energy away from, getting their education and maybe pursuing like a career path towards like a, white collar job. And so there is this kind of tension. And for the book, I interviewed people who'd gone through this sort of process of striving, and you see different degrees in terms of that tension. Some people felt it very keenly. For some people, it's not that they lost their relationship to their family and friends or to their community, but that it weakened. And so you see kind of a range of cases, but I think it is this common feature that you feel this tension between where you come from and feeling connected to that space and being kind of a full participant in that community, and entering these new communities where you find all these opportunities, but that take away from you being kind of fully engaged with your home community.
Yeah, you talk about, you use code switching, which is typically used in terms of race, but I think you can apply it in terms of class as well. I think to some extent, we probably all of us who've been upwardly mobile to some extent engage in that a little bit. We speak differently, we may act differently when we go to kind of our home communities and so on. But I guess my question for you is, well, let me try and make a further distinction first, is that there's sort of the immediate trade-offs, like while you're studying. So there's the difference in the experience between, and we all, if you teach students at different socioeconomic levels as you see this all the time, the difference between the external stresses, right? Are they spending their evenings drinking and hanging out with their buddies or playing lacrosse, or are they taking their grandmother to the hospital and caring for them? Right. So you kind of see that. That's the immediate trade-off. But in some ways, the longer-term trade-off, which is this sort of distance that you talk about, I think is in some ways the more ethically important, because it's the ethical price you pay for upward mobility. But I guess my question is, look, isn't that always the case? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
life is full of regret, and so I think about
Right.
the regrets I might have as a result of having taken the journey that I have, which have had costs for sure, and they've had benefits. But then I look at the people who made a different choice. Let's say I decided not to go to Oxford, decided not to be so upwardly mobile, decided to stay in my hometown. I think I'd regret that, and I think I'd regret it more because I am me. Now, it doesn't mean that the friends I had who made that choice, they regret it. they might, but to some extent, we always regret the path not taken. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, to some extent, isn't this just life?
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent question, and something I've been thinking about a lot. Even after I kind of give an answer in the book, but I don't find it completely satisfying. And I think, well, let me tell you the answer I give in the book. I think that there are some kind of trade-offs that can be very directly tied to background structures of inequality and injustice, and that's what makes them different, right? And that there is a way in which we as a society have decided to organize things in such a way that some people have to make these trade-offs, and others don't have to make them in the same way, right? And so there's a kind of this unequal burden.
There's an inequality in the trade-off, and reducing inequality in trade-offs, I think, is a really kind of worthy goal, because you're quite right. Some people have sharper trade-offs than others.
Yeah, and I think that the other kind of important bit too is the effect that these kind of trade-offs have, not just on the striver, but on their family or their community, right? And so, I see this a lot now teaching in North Carolina, where a lot of the first generation students that we have here are from rural communities, right? So before I came to UNC, I was teaching in New York City, and a lot of our strivers were immigrant kids from the city, and they were still living at home and going to school, and that was a whole different kind of experience of college. Some of my first generation students here come from rural parts of North Carolina, and what they tell me is that their families and their communities know that if they go to Carolina, that means they're in effect leaving their community, right? There's no way they're coming back. They might come back for a visit, but they're not going to be a part of the community in the same way that they were up to that point. And that's the kind of trade-off that I think only some people have to make, right? If you grow up in a more affluent middle-class family in which your parents went to college and their friends went to college, you might move away, you might choose to move away, but there isn't this sense that you must leave to access certain kinds of educational opportunities or career opportunities. Whereas the sense for students who are growing up in predominantly low-income communities is that what it means to go to college really is to put this big distance between them and their home community, and probably forever. And that, I think, has an effect on the student themselves, right, in terms of how they think about their path, but also on the families and the communities who know that, like, they're talented, maybe ambitious children or young people in their community. The path forward for them is a path out, right, and not in the community.
If you have an unequal society and it's geographically unequal, and you have certain centers of academic learning that are more selective, perhaps of higher quality than others, then what you've just described is a sort of inevitable consequence of those inequalities. And I think that obviously, and you argue strongly for this, that we can reduce those inequalities. And I agree. And I think I want to get on to where we take our elite from in a moment, because there's a bit of a vicious circle here. You have to go to the flagship or the Ivy League because that's the bottleneck. I don't know if you know. Do you know Joe Fishkin's work?
Yeah, exactly.
So interesting.
And I think it's not just the educational institution, though that's an important bit of it, but it's also where the jobs are, right? So if you get a computer science degree from Carolina and then you're thinking, like, where will I go? You're probably not going to go out to rural North Carolina for your job. And so, we could envision a system in which, yes, you go away to college, but that's like a temporary thing, right? And then you come back to your community where there's a job there for you, that makes use of your education and helps you lead to your communities thriving. But that's not the situation in many rural communities or low-income communities.
It's not even an option. But I think about some of my own friends, high school friends I'm talking about now, who did go away to university, and sometimes they even pursued a career in London for a while. But then when they had children themselves, they went back to the town that I grew up in, which is in Peterborough, just north of London. And I think that's a bit of a trend. Sometimes people might move later, but it does require, at least for the labor market there, to be sufficiently developed to be able to make something of your skills, right? You probably face some trade-offs, but that example of of my friends going back and me not doing it does come back to this question of choice and autonomy. And I worry a little bit that your analysis doesn't put quite enough emphasis on autonomy and on, if you like, the site where these trade-offs are made is the site of the individual. And so, of course, there may be part of me that regrets having lost some of the sense of community from being in my hometown, but I trade that off against all the other opportunities I've had, and I choose one bundle of ethical goods over another, right?
Right.
And other friends who could, and here's the thing: I look at them, and I think this is a problem with the discourse around social mobility generally. And basically, what I say is, why can't you be more like me? And I think that's the summary of social mobility discourse is very often a version of why aren't you more like me? Because it's either dominated by people who are already affluent and successful, or who, like you and I, have moved up. And I wasn't raised poor or anything. Don't misunderstand me. And so we sort of look down, both literally and metaphorically, at the people who aren't doing that, who could do that. Right. And I was like, what's wrong with you? And the answer is, what's nothing wrong with me. It's just I have a different bundle of goods, ethical. I'm choosing a different bundle of ethical goods, and I'm valuing being where I grew up more strongly than you are. And to which a good liberal might just say, great. That's the great thing about liberal societies, is that individuals can choose different versions of the ethical goods and have different regrets as a result. So what are we complaining about?
Yeah, good. So I think there is kind of a deeper point here, and in a way, you're nicely articulating that there is this moment of choice. Have these bundles of goods that are competing against each other. One hope that I had in writing the book was to articulate why it's reasonable not to choose the upward mobility bundle, right? That there are genuinely valuable good things you're choosing. And choosing this other bundle of goods, you're not making a mistake, right? It's not some sort of like rational deficit that all of a sudden you decide you don't want to pursue this path of higher education and want to stay in your community. The problem, of course, is that this often consigns you, in particular in places like the United States, right, to less access to good education for your children, to like a clean environment, to good jobs. So I think that the trade-off that people face ends up being between remaining connected to family and friends and community and seeing those as really valuable, but that comes with trading off things that I think nobody should have to trade off to be connected to their family, friends, and community, and appreciating those goods, valuing them in the right way, and so on. The more kind of perhaps underlying radical thought here is that a lot of us are being forced to make those choices. And what happens in that some of us who are in like these more affluent kind of, upper middle class circles is that we're kind of trained in a way and encouraged to not value those attachments quite as strongly, so that we are mobile and are willing to pick up, as I will in next week, you can see like the moving boxes behind me, to move to Philly. And, because...
Oh, I didn't know that. Are you moving to Philly? Why?
Yeah, I'm moving to the University of Pennsylvania.
I thought didn't you just move to UNC?
It's complicated, but okay. Yeah, exactly, right? Like we get a kind of encouraged to be mobile and to not form too deep of attachments in order to be able to move around. And I think we hold up people who prioritize
Mhm.
career and their career advancement and don't think too hard about what it is they're sacrificing in terms of like the attachments to place, to community, to neighborhood, right? To family that they might be
Yeah, yeah.
making for that.
So I like that rebalancing, and it's something that I've thought about a bit myself too. I'm aware that in some of my own work, it is a kind of what's wrong with you mentality. Actually, I don't know if I can find the study, but this would be of interest to you. I don't think you referenced this work. There was a study looking at comparing white and Latino students in Texas somewhere, and which ones went away to a selective college, a highly selective college, which would have meant moving away. And the study, conditional on SAT, GPA, all the measures they could have, they still find this big gap. And they could explain all of the gap by the answer to one question in the survey, which they all received, which is how important is it for you to be near family?
Wow.
And it's exactly what you've been talking about, which is
right.
And so as a sort of social mobility wonk, I look at that and I think, is that a problem?
Right.
And you think, well, yes, because what it means is that the Latino kids who are just as qualified as the white kids aren't getting as, quotes, good an education. They're probably still, they went to the local state university or something, so probably still got a very good education. But there's going to be a white Hispanic gap down the line. Yeah. On the other hand, so they've told me why they're not doing it, which is that they want to be near their family. So then the next question is like, so the problem is the familiarism, the culture of familiarism in Latino communities. And so what we need to do is go in there and break that up and stop them caring about family so much because they're ruining my quintile transition matrices. And it's like really interesting moments where it's like, actually, and my view is that's not a problem. So long as, and here's my caveat, so long as I feel reasonably sure that the decisions being made by those young people are with some decent awareness of the costs and benefits, right? They're not doing it. They're not doing it blindly. And so if they say, yeah, I could have gone away to UNC or UPenn, but I'd rather be near mum and dad, and I realize that may cost me, something, right. And vice versa. If I do decide to go, I realize that it might, cost me something in terms of my family relationship.
Yeah, but I think once we realize, as we were talking about just a minute ago, what gets attached to that choice to stay in other domains of their lives, right? Like health and education and career disparities, their earning potential and so on. Then I think we need to step back as a society and think, how much do we value, right? Family and community and the associational life. If what we in fact have done is set up our economy in such a way that the incentives are structured to make those bonds weaker if we're interested in pursuing like career opportunities or educational opportunities or these other goods that lead to the productive economy. And I think that's the part that for me is troubling. And it might be that I come from this kind of like, culture in which family and attachment is really important. But one thing I've noticed is actually, in talking to my students here who come from rural North Carolina, is that there are many parts in the U.S. of like white, Americans who have been here for a while, who are not immigrants, who also share this attachment and valuing of, the associational life, like these relationships and family relationships and community relationships, and who are not happy about having to trade them off for economic opportunities. And so I think that tension is pretty deep, and I don't think we really have a way of figuring out what the things that we say don't kind of really hit the nail on the head in terms of what values are at stake. And the fact that we often set up the incentive structures so as to devalue or demean people's attachment to, their communities and the places in which they grow up and the people with whom they grow up.
Yeah, and I'm glad you made the point that that's true for lots of communities of different colors and creeds and so on, across the US. In fact, very often immigrants, it's true, I think immigrants are more geographically mobile than non-immigrants are in the US. And so I think that's an important caveat. I think you've helped me clarify my view on this a bit, which is, in an ideal world, I think you could take this view, which is the liberal view, which is, yes, there are competing goods, and we trust, and what we do is we trust individuals to choose their bundle of goods. And what you're saying is that the way that the political economy is structured is that it makes the cost of certain choices too high. And so whilst it's fine for me to say, well, look, my friends who want to stay in the hometown and have they put more weight on associational goods or being near family than I do. It sounds like you do.
Right.
Great. So we can jet around, and I live in a different country now to where I grew up, and I have an American wife. And so it's I'm thousands of miles away, as you are. But I have other friends that have chosen. Great. But I think what you're pointing to is, we have to be careful not to embed a view of the weighting of those goods into our political economy in such a way that it does give preferential treatment effectively to chooser type A, Jen and Richard, right?
Yeah.
Rather than chooser type B.
That's a really excellent way of articulating it. And, we can think of comparisons. So I have family in Norway, and my aunt lives in a somewhat small town in the southern coast of Norway. A town that has like farming, and lots of people there have lived there for many, many, many generations. So she married a Norwegian man, my uncle, and he's extremely wealthy, actually. He's from an extremely wealthy family. They help pay for my education. So I'm very thankful to them. But as a kid, I would go visit them. And what was striking to me is that, well, one, there's just more socioeconomic integration at school and in their social life, right? Mm-hmm. So my cousins have a lot of money. They could go anywhere, right? They, at least one of them they attend the like local public school, and his friends are like plumbers and, are going to go into construction work. And so it's just a diversity in terms of the people that he's interacting with is remarkable. Not racial diversity, obviously, because this is Norway.
Norway.
But also that lots of smart, well-educated young Norwegians decide at some point that they want to stay in their community, and they'll take a job that maybe doesn't pay a ton, but all the jobs pay well enough that you could have a reasonable life and enjoy having vacation and all that, healthcare and all that stuff, because they are so tied to this community, right? And so some of them might leave and go to Oslo because they're ambitious in that way, but lots of people stay, and they are very proud of that kind of those intergenerational connections they have, right? So my uncle will, somebody will come over and he's like, his grandfather and my grandfather used to run through the woods and do this and that, and and they just have this history that they are very proud of, and those bonds are so important to them. And part of it, I think, is the economic safety net, right?
Yes, they can afford it in that sense. I just want to clarify: this is a different wealthy guy.
No, this is my uncle. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
For a moment, then I thought you had sort of that. I was going to say that your family is very good at finding and marrying wealth, but okay, it's the same wealth. But I agree. I think what motivates, a lot of your work and some of my work too now is lowering the stakes effectively, is to just, the stakes are just too high. And it's one of the big arguments, I think, for universal provision of one kind or another, which is if you just feel like everything's on the line and it's a zero-sum game, then it matters too much. In other words, it's one of something motivates my work is I think the reason the upper middle class are so very often so sort of paranoid in their obsessive behavior around how their kids are going to do and which college they get to and so on is because they really don't want them to fall, because it doesn't look great down there. It doesn't look lower down the rung. It doesn't look great. Whereas if it looked okay down there, then maybe they'd relax a little bit. maybe the zero-sum games around some of these bottlenecks would reduce. And so I think there's a vicious circle at work here, which is the more unequal we are, the higher the stakes, the more expensive the trade-offs. But this issue about community, maybe you've raised it. I didn't see Norway coming, so that was a great addition to your global perspective. But this issue about damaging the communities that are left behind, you talk about the talented people who leave, and that's interesting to me too, because I fear there that the danger sometimes is that it could have quite a chilling effect on individuals. It's almost like some of them feel guilty enough about leaving their community. I think about this even in my own sort of family context. And so to some extent, there's a danger maybe kind of piling onto that and saying, you see, you've left them behind, they're going to struggle. And so take a made-up example. I'm an Amish young woman, and I decide I want to break away from the Amish community, go to university, and live in New York, etc. And that's a big loss to the Amish community, right? But she doesn't want the views about gender. She doesn't want to farm. She doesn't want to be Amish, right? Now, the Amish community is weakened by her decision to go to college in New York, but it's not clear to me how much weight I should put on that loss as opposed to her autonomy and her right to choose her own good life.
Yeah, and I think typically the debate over this issue of community and autonomy, in traditional political philosophy has been to see it through cases like that of the Amish, right? And to see that the individual's autonomy, if you're a good liberal egalitarian, can't come at the expense of this community's claim that it's a loss to them. And I think that's right. I think what's interesting about the cases of strivers and the people that I've been thinking about, so, Latinx, but also African Americans and immigrant communities in the United States, is that in many of those cases, there isn't this sort of like claim, even on the part of families, right, that you shouldn't leave or anything like that. Like, many of these parents want to see their children do well, right? They want to see their children succeed educationally. And many members of the community want to see like the talented young people in their midst do well educationally. And so for them, like, they might agree that the trade-off makes sense, right? They might say like, yes, great, you like went and did something of yourself and you're leading a great life and we're all so proud of you. But that doesn't quite, I think, erase the fact that there was this loss, and that the loss is to some extent a consequence of how we've arranged our economy and the distribution of opportunities in this country. And so it's, in the traditional case of the Amish, you have like this conception of a good life that is in tension with kind of Western democratic, autonomy-centered values. And there is a clash of like kind of conceptions of the good, as we would say in political philosophy. I think in the case of like, the first generation college student who wants to go to university and their families who want to support them, there isn't really a clash. And there's a clash, but the clash is contingent, right? It's just a clash as a result of the ways in which we've organized opportunities, not a clash that is inherent to, right, like being the sort of person that loves being a part of a community and feeling connected to others and having a good job and being able to afford to pay for healthcare and send your children to a good school. Those things should go together, we think. A society like ours. And for some people, they can't go together. And I think that's the part that is kind of tricky about these cases.
Yeah, so we were trying to broaden the range of bundles that people can kind of put together effectively. I'm thinking about Sen's capability sets a little bit here. It's almost like, think about the different bundles you could put together. And what I hear you saying is, actually, if we worked harder at this, we could actually expand the number of bundles that are available to people and make the trade-off less sharp. And I think you argue quite strongly that one way to do that is to reduce educational inequality. So maybe, a better example than the Amish, maybe I have family and godkids and so on in Baltimore City. And all the kids who come through Baltimore City schools who are advised by anyone who knows the system say, don't go to Baltimore City Community College. Get out. Go somewhere else. Because the graduation rate is, even by US community, very, very low. It's just a very weak college. No criticism of them. It's a very weird history. But it's like, you should go. And you think, well, why should you have to? let's say you want to go to community college. That's the route that's
Mm-hmm.
best for you. And you grew up in Baltimore City and you'd like to stay in Baltimore City. And I can think of lots of members of our family who would like to do that. Why should I have to leave to get a decent community college education? And so that's maybe a kind of better example of how we could let's make Baltimore City Community College an amazing community college. Maybe Hopkins.
Right, exactly.
And then the people I know who are making that choice say, great, I can still live with my grandmother and look after her and go to a great community college. And so I buy all of that. I then think the question is, of course, how one does that. I want to move on a bit to this work you've done around complicity, and the place that we all have in this sort of system. And you've just described your own moves, actually. And it's just very interesting. Essentially, I hope I don't butcher the argument, but I think one of your worries is that the upwardly mobile, the strivers, etc., get co-opted one way or another by the very elite systems they've been broken into in ways that mean that they're not as powerful as they could be in opening up those systems to other people. So it's not quite we pull the ladder up behind us, but it's very much along that line, isn't it? And so talk a bit more about how you wrote this very good article, which we'll link to, around complicity in the academy, reflecting on your own experience. Can you talk a bit more about and how complicit you feel like you are in it, and I am, and so on, and what we can do about it?
Yeah, good. So there is this tension, I think, that anyone who's a striver and is very cognizant of the ways in which these unjust structures have impacted our paths. And I think this is many, many strivers, right? Like you realize how lucky you were to end up in this path and how easily things could have been derailed and you ended up in a different path. That as you succeed, there's a lot of pressure within institutions to not rock the boat, right? Like to sort of go along, right? And I think this is true for all of us, right? This is kind of the nature of institutions, and the nature of how they work is that they have certain norms, right? And that you play a role within this institution, and doing your role well is how you will get rewarded and how you will move up. And so pushing against these norms, against how the institution is set up, is always potentially going to derail you, right? And and if you're someone who comes from an economically disadvantaged background, that derailment can feel very dangerous, right? Because you think, and this goes back to the point you were making earlier, this kind of zero-sum game. You feel like, I don't have something to fall back on if this goes badly, right? And if I invested my life in this educational, career or whatever other career I have, I might not feel like I have a lot of alternatives except doing this well. But doing this well sometimes involves going along and being complicit in norms that you recognize are meant to keep some people out, and that are exclusionary and benefit people who come from more privileged backgrounds and the rest of it. And so it becomes this really tough line to walk where you're trying to, at the same time, change the system, within the bounds of what you can do and push back on some of those pressures. And at the same time, you earned this position and you don't want to lose it, right? You earned your place, and you want to be able to keep doing your job. So, what I talk about in the article, which I've seen a lot of in the academy, is people who come from underrepresented backgrounds and are on the tenure track, or maybe they're a postdoc or a grad student. So they're in these vulnerable positions within the academy, right? They don't have tenure. They might not be paid very well. And then a lot hangs on them succeeding. And who gets to decide what success looks like is the senior people in their department, like the senior people in university administration, the people who are refereeing papers through the peer review process, right? And generally, those people tend to be fairly conservative about the institution, not conservative in the capital C, but in the little C way, right? Like this system has worked well for them. They, they're happy for the system to continue as it is. And what ends up happening is that there's this tension between wanting to push back on how the system is set up, because you see that it's not serving, say, your students well or other people like you well, but at the same time wanting to do well by the standards of the institution, and it. I think it's this real tension. And yeah, for me, it's been something I've been thinking about a lot throughout my career. And, I try to kind of push the boundaries of my role while keeping my role. On the other hand, I think there is little that individuals can do often, right? So, maybe this goes back to some of the stuff that you talk about in your book, Dream Hoarders. The parent who's thinking like, do I game the system to get my kid into the good public school or send them to private school, knows that they're feeding into a system that is unjust, that contributes to educational inequality. At the same time, their one kid going to this or that school is unlikely to really change anything, right? And so you end up feeling kind of caught in between these two pressures.
Yeah.
And I think many of us experience this, whether it's in your job or in where you send your kid to school or what neighborhood you decide to live in, where you feel like there isn't really a very good choice either way. And you feel kind of complicit either way, perhaps.
Well, unless you're willing to, I think, take extraordinary lengths, sacrificial lengths, I think. I remember giving a talk once and a woman about my book, and this woman said that she was a professional woman, pretty affluent. She'd deliberately chosen to live near the lowest performing school in Washington, D.C., predominantly African-American, because she said, that's what I have to do. That's my bit. And she was effectively accusing me of being a hypocrite because although my kids are at public high school, it's in well, they're not anymore, but it was in an affluent suburb. And then I can accuse my friends who've paid for their kids to go to private school of being hypocrites. And, the finger pointing can go on forever. And I said to her, look, well, good for you. But on the other hand, actually, I think there's a line here, which is starting to treat your own children as social policy interventions. Yep. For me, it's a bit of a step too far. And that's, it's not just a binary between you're either fully complicit in the system, or you're an angel. There's a sort of series of trade-offs. We're back to trade-offs that you make along the way. And in my work, it's just been, I think, similar to yours, is to try and make the trade-offs more explicit and have people argue for them. But I think it's this question about norms and trying to create norms around these paths. I mean, your own work, you write in your book, you were writing about City College, New York, and I love the CUNY system. It obviously does very well on all the social mobility metrics from Chetty and others that you cite. But your own distance is I'm pushing you on this a little bit, but is growing, right? So I did the Chetty lookup. I actually gave a talk at UNC Chapel Hill recently, so I had these numbers in hand. I'll find them for Penn. But at City College, New York, the median household income of a student was $40,000. 15% of them came from the top 20%, and 23% came from the bottom 20% of the income distribution. Yeah. UNC Chapel Hill, median is $135,000 a year. 60% of the students come from the top 20%, 4% from the bottom 20%. Yeah. So I was going to push you a little bit on how it felt to have made that journey. And now I can ask you about your next step. I haven't Googled the numbers on Penn, but I can assure you they won't be better than Chapel Hill.
No, they will not. It's been a really interesting experience thinking through these choices, and to some extent, some of the choices end up being about, family and, what's convenient for my husband and like all of these other factors. One trade-off that I think I was making was in effect getting some recognition and engagement with my work, which is much easier to do when you're at a R1 university than at a research intensive, but still like a public college that doesn't quite have the same standing. And I think that was one factor that went into it. Another, and alluding back to the discussion of like where to send your kids to school, is about where you draw the line around work conditions, right? And so there was a lot about CUNY and teaching at CUNY that I loved. I love the students. I still miss teaching those students. There's nothing like being in a classroom with people that have like kids and jobs, and also young 18-year-olds who are idealistic, and and having those two sets of students talk to each other and come at things from such different perspectives. I think we really miss out on that in many of the kind of highly selective universities and college. And in fact, there is like very little diversity and experiences in the classroom, in terms of even just like age, right? A lived experience and so on. So I miss that terribly. And also in an environment in which there are more people of color and there are more people who are first generation and, all of that. But we got pushed at CUNY, and this happens all over the country, obviously, to have bigger and bigger classes, kind of worse working conditions, trying to increase the teaching load. And at some point you feel like you're not teaching as well as you could when you have, 120 students in a semester, and somebody says, you're supposed to teach these students how to write an essay. Like that's,
yeah. You hit resource constraints, and
you hit resource constraints. I think also for me, some of my work has been, as you mentioned earlier, about the elite and how we educate the elite. And I've gotten a lot from being at different sorts of educational institutions. I'm kind of an observer of how these institutions work, and that's where a lot of the creative energy for my work comes from. So I really was excited about coming to Chapel Hill, in part because the first generation students here look different than the first generation students at CUNY, and our students from rural communities. And that's a totally different set of students with different concerns, who were coming at college, in a different way than my students in New York City. So I was excited about that. But it is hard. I know that I am, in a way, making choices that are responding to incentives in the system that reward, research expertise and so on, at the expense of having people with this research expertise be in front of the classroom of majority low income, majority first gen students and majority students of color. It's very hard to find a place where you can get both of these things together, like research support and you're teaching this population of students. And so, it's been hard thinking about those trade-offs.
Yeah,
and definitely I have all sorts of complicated feelings about it.
Well, I think if we're not experiencing some cognitive dissonance, we're not doing our work properly in this space. I actually gave a talk about my book. I was sort of ranting about the segregation in higher education in the US, and someone looked at my bio, and at the time I was teaching part-time at Georgetown as well as being at Brookings Institution, incredibly elite institution. And they came up to the microphone and they're questioned, why do you teach at Georgetown? And I had this moment of thinking, oh my God. And so I never have since, and I'm sure saying this out loud means I never will again. And in fact, Brookings instead set up a lecture series with UDC, which is an HBCU.
I just gave a talk at UDC.
So it was this moment of like, and I hadn't even thought about it. I'd done it because Brookings has a relationship with Georgetown. It's easy, and it's like the equivalent of the Twitter blue check. It's like you just and that's I was like, how many credentials do I actually need before I feel like I'm okay? This is a constant up the credential inflation. It's just this like Brookings.
So the final thing I will say that makes me feel slightly better is that
I want you to feel better.
Right. My plan in moving to Penn is, another interest of mine, and you share this interest, is in the inequality between institutions of higher education, right? Not just like students, but how many resources some institutions, right? The Georgetowns of Penns amass at the expense of UDC and City College of New York. And so part of my plan for going to Penn and part of, what I negotiated is I want to start a kind of partnership with a community college. And I think there's a lot to be gained. I mean, I'm generally skeptical of win-win situations, but I think this might be genuinely a case in which Penn students could get a lot from being an intellectual community with community college students and vice versa. And I think there's just a lot of knowledge in community colleges, for example, about how to teach and how to teach well and how to teach a diverse, a diverse group of students. And I know from my experience, being at Stanford for my PhD, that students at very elite institutions do not get very good training in how to teach. And they don't get very good training in how to teach students who don't come from similarly elite backgrounds. And yet those students end up getting jobs in non-elite colleges and universities. And then they get there and they're not entirely sure how to teach these students. Whereas in community colleges, in some flagship public universities, you have people who are amazing teachers. And I know this from being at CUNY, and who know how to teach that population of students really well. And I think there's a lot of knowledge that could be gained there, for Penn students. And I think there is a lot to be gained in terms of resource sharing, kind of picturing like having invited lectures where the audience is both students from a community college and students from Penn. So my idea is to sort of come up with a project, and a lot of it requires finding the right partners, in which there is this kind of sharing of knowledge and resources around philosophy, an intellectual topic, building intellectual community. Because I think these like incredibly well-resourced institutions, the way they're dealing with the critiques leveled at them is focusing on, say, admitting a slightly more first-generation college students or low-income students and giving them more resources, right? And that's such a tiny fraction.
Yes. Well, it's,
the students that need these educational resources.
I completely agree. It's a tiny fraction of a tiny fraction. I mean, the proportion of US population that went to Ivy League is 0.2 or something. And so at some point you are, all important though it is, dancing on the head of a pin. And I agree also there's an amateurishness to the teaching at those really elite institutions. They're really there for the research, and then you're just supposed to somehow magically pick up the ability to teach, which is why there's so much horrific teaching that people are spending a fortune on in those places. But that's a nice way into the last thing I want to touch on, was this provocative new piece you've got on the miseducation. I think it's called The Miseducation of Our Elite. And I think it's directly relevant to what you were just discussing, which is the problem of drawing our elite from such a narrow range of institutions. And then because we do that, having a model of affirmative action, which presumes that by ticking certain boxes, you're getting the representation of different groups, right. But you're missing something very important. So I'm going to read a couple of sentences from the paper about the Supreme Court, which I think is a nice illustration. You say, a Supreme Court that is composed entirely of Ivy League graduates is not as representative as it could be, even if it numbers among its ranks an African-American man, a Latina woman, and a Jewish woman. This obviously, I guess, written a little while ago. Actually, earlier this year, I guess, right? So the suggestion...
Yeah, it's, the acceptance to production.
Exactly. That's it, right. Well, that's one of the reasons why I'm not an academic. But but here's the key bit. The suggestion at the heart of this article is it would be even more representative if among its ranks it also had graduates from Cal State, City University of New York. Yeah, I guess you had to have that one in there. Texas A&M, because we're lacking this educational experience. And the people who, and maybe you're one of these people, is even if they come from a more diverse background, by the time these institutions are done with them, they've been elitized. They've been made to think the way we do. And so they lose all their ability to actually change. So there's a different kind of representation. I mean, characterize that problem correctly, and then what do we do about that?
Yeah, so I think that we often conceive of educational institutions in terms of these kind of black boxes, right? And we think, okay, who's getting into Harvard, right? And then you have the Harvard degree, that means something, right? But what is happening within these educational institutions in terms of how students are being shaped? And I think that what we don't often acknowledge is that elite institutions tend to shape students in very similar ways. And that's a product of who's there, right? And most of the people there are from very privileged backgrounds. And so even if you have a student coming from a low-income background or a first-generation background, or, a student who comes from a very rural area, or what have you, slowly they will be socialized into the norms, the expectations, the ideas of this very narrow way of looking at the world. And what I think is missing is that there are educational institutions, for me, obviously CUNY is the model, but Cal State and so on, in which what is happening within the institutions is very different in terms of whose voices are being heard, what ideas are being discussed. And those institutions have something to contribute to our elite's education, right? And so actually, I was recently kind of finishing up the semester here and talking to a group of seniors. It was their last semester of college, about their experience at Carolina and what they learned. And this very insightful young woman and said to me, I've had a great time here and I've learned a lot, but I really wish that in my classes there were people that were older and had families, and there were just not 18 or 19 years old, and that they weren't like her. I was like, there are such colleges and universities, not this one, but there are such places, and they do contribute to the education of those students in a way that goes unrecognized. That students that emerge from those institutions know something about the world that many students at Ivy League colleges put out don't, right? Because they really haven't had those interactions. And that's a really valuable skill set that I think many in the elite are missing, and that it's very hard to get at an elite institution.
And it means that the institutions that draw from those institutions end up being weakened too, because you're drawing people with that narrow mindset. You quote some of the work on epistemic justice, but there's this question, and I think you argue for epistemic diversity, and that diversity includes perhaps above all different experiences educationally, socially, etc. And that's in some way, I would argue that's a more important kind of diversity, both for the production of knowledge, but in our elite, than, if you like, the other kinds of, I'm trying to kind of phrase it, the diversity you can see more easily, right?
Yeah.
You quote Anthony Jack's work a little bit too, because I think it is quite easy for institutions to say, look how diverse we are. Like, well, back to your Supreme Court example, are you? And actually, in some cases, one of your students from a low-income background, a white man from a very low-income background in rural Carolina, might bring more epistemic diversity to a seminar room than a bunch of people who all went to private K-12 schools, even if they're of different racial backgrounds, right?
Yeah, and that's when I feel the most complicit, I think, sometimes, when people look at me and they think, we're doing so great on the diversity front. Look at her, first gen, Latino woman, immigrant.
Yeah.
Hey,
that's right. You tick 4 boxes in one go.
Yeah, I'm like, I do tick all of those boxes, but in a way, I'm extremely comfortable in these elite spaces, ever more comfortable in these elite spaces, certainly than I was when I got to college. And that affects how you see the world and how your experiences are structured and what you notice and don't notice. And so, you have to do a lot of work to sort of get out of that bubble if you're in it. It's not, you're very few people are pushing back on you to kind of step outside of seeing the world through that educational experience. And so I think it is that kind of clash, right? When you have someone coming from a very different educational experience. And for me, in a way, my education wasn't complete without having been at CUNY, where I really felt like my students pushed back autonomy a lot. And it was, challenging in a way that hadn't been challenged before. And that was great. And I kind of wish more people who are so-called in the elite had those experiences of being challenged by people who come from different educational backgrounds, who haven't had this sort of, elite experience. Yeah.
It's almost too smooth. I mean, these institutions try to run, in a frictionless way, smoothly oiled by what you call the sort of social ease. And I think one of the things we've been talking about here is both the value of and necessity for dissonance, discomfort, friction. It was uncomfortable. I mean, we did the thing at Brookings where we brought in all these high schoolers. We brought in 100 high schoolers. Instead of take your kids to work day, we said, no, it's stupid to take our own kids to work. Let's bring something. And an institution was like, well, where will they eat and what will we do and will it be noisy? And it was crazy, but it was fantastic and unsettling and so on. But I do think that's right in terms of this is difficult, and the challenge I think probably also for you, because as you just said, you try to tick these boxes, is almost like, why do I then also have to be the one introducing the friction? Right? It's actually much easier for people like me. I think there's in some ways a different moral responsibility for the people whom it's harder to say, oh, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? So I think that's a different kind of moral responsibility. Yeah.
Although I tend to think about the responsibility we have in terms of what you're in a good position to do. Mm-hmm. And so I think I'm in a good position to do certain kind of work, and that's how I take comfort in these spaces I occupy, because I don't think it would necessarily help anyone, to go back to our earlier discussion. If I turned down a job at, say, UNC or UPenn because I thought, well, I can't be complicit in this system, I can't get out of complicity. Like I exist in the economy of higher education, and the question is where, given where your position and your skills and your knowledge set, how can you use that towards hopefully, bending things towards a more just world? And so that's how I think of it. Like, what, in my position, what can I do? And I think we should all be thinking that way.
How do we use the power that we have? Well, good. Thank you so much for joining me. I love that conversation. I was excited for it, and it lived up to my expectations at least. So thank you for your work, and I'd love to keep in touch with what you're up to.
Yes, definitely.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Dialogues. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you did, please take a moment to follow, like, rate, and share the podcast in all the usual places. And send me your thoughts and ideas, including for future guests, to dialoguespod@gmail.com. That's dialoguespod@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.